If you think bike media today, you think mostly online. You think of YouTubers and influencers unboxing, presenting, and maybe testing products. This wasn't always the case. Hard to imagine, but print was king and our main source of information. There are only a handful of editors or writers out there which experienced this transformation to the media as we know it today. James Huang and I are two of them. My name is Jens Staudt and a warm welcome to over 100 minutes of history in the development of bike media, covering the rise of online reviews and online race coverage, the influence of people like Alex Rankin and Clay Porter, the rise of Pinkbike, centralization of power on the media houses, and some ideas on how bike people would like to consume information in the future.
How to start on this one? This is a big one. I have James Huang on the podcast today, and I think we both look really forward to get a deep dive on the topic, and it is a quarter century. We will cover today a quarter century, more than a quarter century of bike media.
We're gonna try to anyway.
Yeah, and I think we could frame ourselves as somewhat of veterans out of the bike media, and then maybe give you a little insight on how you started. You had been with Cycling Tips and Bike Radar. Is that correct?
The first time I was actually paid to write anything as a job, let's put it that way, that came in March 2005 when I started freelancing for Cycling News, actually. At the time, even before then, I think for about 5 years or so, I was running my own website called angryasian.com. And that was a site that I had put together, or at least I had a friend put together for me anyway. But on that site, it was all about front suspension maintenance and modification and tuning. And I put that together at a time when I was working part-time at a bike shop back then. But I was doing a lot of front suspension work for the local community because the suspension was starting to get pretty popular. And at that point, there really wasn't any information to be found online from the manufacturers as far as what you were supposed to do. So I did it.
When we first met, it was at a track press camp in Sedona,
Oh dear God! I don't know.
It could be 20 years ago.
It could have been 20 years ago. Yeah, easily.
I was like, at that time, started to work for a German online magazine. Back then, everybody called it the IBC, the Internet Bike Community, but actually it has a news part of it. And Thomas Patz was the founder, and I was a user. And I somehow slipped into, or I got drawn into covering stuff. And one day he asked, hey, would you like to join me and travel to the Sea Otter Classic and cover this event? And fast forward, I worked for them and then attended bazillions of press camps, I guess. And potentially we two met at one of them, I guess.
Yeah, you and I have spent far too much time on airplanes, sitting in airports, sitting in buses, that sort of thing.
And the funny thing is, because if you've been around the block a couple of times in the bike media or in the bike industry, and we mentioned that early on in the intro, it underwent a lot of changes, the bike industry. And it's not necessarily only because the internet media, online media became so strong, but let's start maybe around the year 2000. So what was your media consumption back then? Do you remember that?
I would say I spent very little time on, I would say back then I spent pretty little time on the internet, despite the fact that I was just starting to run my own website. There just wasn't really that much out there from what I remember. What I do definitely remember is subscribing to a lot of print magazines. I would go to the local bookstore because they had a section of international magazines, and at that time, a lot of the UK publications were probably the best mountain bike magazines that I could find. They were big. They had a lot of information in them. They obviously cost a little bit more because they had to be imported, but those were always ones that I liked a lot, just because they had a lot in them. So my media consumption for bike stuff back then certainly was very, very heavily print centric.
Absolutely. I still remember to that day when I was into bikes, but I just were into bikes, and I had friends riding bikes and just like shooting around in the woods, and I had no idea about any kind of media, or that there are magazines, and at some point I was at the train station, and which had a bookstore in it. And I was going in there, and I saw, back then it was called Mountain Bike Downhill. This is the equivalent. It later on became the Mountain Bike Rider magazine, because they focused not only on downhill and gravity, but they changed their approach. And this was the very first magazine I saw, and I think it was the second issue they ever published. And it was the very beginning of this magazine, and I really got drawn into that. Of course, there was already in Germany the so-called Bike magazine. There is an equivalent in the US, but it's not the same outlet. It's just the same name. And later on, I also saw Mountain Bike. These had been the three German magazines. At some point, but I don't know exactly remember when, I stumbled over Dirt magazine. And you mentioned already the UK scene, and this blew me away because it was so different, right?
I don't remember if we had Dirt imported here, so I think I was exposed to Dirt a lot later. But yeah, it was definitely very different. But what was cool about some of the print media back then was, despite the fact that there wasn't nearly the breadth of information and just content in general that we have now, I think you could still find print magazines, print publications that really cater to your own personal interests. So I always felt like that was kind of neat. And it's funny, you talked about when you were sitting, at that train station and you saw that magazine for the first time. I don't know how it was in Germany in the early 2000s, but I know, at least where I was, I lived in southeastern Michigan at the time. I had gone there for university. I just stayed after I graduated, and mountain biking was definitely like a very much a niche sport. There were not very many of us, so to be exposed to publications where you felt like you were part of a bigger community, that was a big deal.
Absolutely. I also remember in the 90s, that there hasn't been a thing like YouTube or any like on-demand broadcasting. You just followed linear television, and I was just like zapping through the channels, and by accident, I have no clue what kind of show it was, but it was Missy Jove on Intense, if I remember it correctly, and showing like this dried piranha necklace she was rocking at that time, and it was totally rock and roll, punk rock, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
It was, I saw, and it was just like overall maybe a 10-second of clips of her ripping down a mountain hillside. Like it was so random, but I was like blown away. And it was just, as you said, it wasn't a mainstream sport back then, and you couldn't get any kind of media. And then you had like the only chance to actually consume media was print. There was no video. And even though, I mean, in the 90s there had been, when did the overall Grundig sponsoring of the Downhill World Cup started?
Oh
Do
my
you
goodness.
remember?
I don't remember. It should have been right around that period though.
When I was younger, we haven't had cable TV. We only had like
yeah.
4 channels, so
Same.
that was out of my range. So
Yep.
I don't remember. And as said, I think, and coming back to the print magazines, they were the big deal. You could consume news about new bikes, like stories, travel stuff, etc. And it was print only, for me at least. And I think back then, with slow internet speeds, there wasn't even a market, or it was just the very early days of YouTube. There were no possibilities of actually, like, people nowadays, they can just have a World Cup. You could cover a World Cup on an iPhone. No big deal. But back then, the technology wasn't there, neither for capturing nor for broadcasting. It was all print.
Oh yeah. I mean, even if you had the technology to capture, it would take you so long to broadcast and download. Oh, forget it. You'd be sitting there forever.
I think that made it pretty much a monopole of print media. If you remember Pinkbike and MTB News, if you maybe talk these main player, German-speaking and English-based platform, they were starting around 2000, right? Or 1999. And
I don't remember the actual year when Pinkbike started, but it is around when, as far as media started really kind of starting to grow. Because again, like I started working for Cycling News in 2005, and they were already quite well established at that point. When I started it was definitely kind of a novelty to be working for an internet only publication. I mean, I still remember going to trade shows and stuff like that, and having to almost had to argue to get a press pass for stuff because people were like, "Oh, you don't have an actual print publication? Like,
Oh
that's
yeah,
not media. What is that?" No, for a while it was called new media. I remember that.
that's funny. That's
Yeah.
really, I remember. Almost forgot that because we were going through the accreditation process, and then you haven't had a press pass kind of thing, like some kind of we haven't had a license. There wasn't like we weren't. Yeah, you could say we weren't proper journalists. We were just bike dudes being interested in stuff.
Yeah.
And we attended the trade shows for forever. And we sneaked into the trade shows before that even we covered it with like passes from bike shops, which got their passes from the bike manufacturers to be invited, come over and to make their order for next year, right? Do you remember like asking your local bike shop to get a pass for one of the trade shows?
I think that was, yeah, very, very early. I never had to go through a shop really to get a pass when I was working for, I guess after I started working for Cycling News. But certainly when I was running my own website, I'm pretty sure I attended at least one or two interbikes under the title of my local bike shop that I was working part-time for. Because for sure, they weren't going to accredit just anyone who ran some random website back then. I mean, a lot of times the people who were providing the accreditation didn't even know what websites were.
I remember that we had to set up a page where the editor with your face or your face is showing like MTB News dash team, and then you had to have your face shot in there and your name, and you could prove that you are on this side because they wouldn't trust.
Yeah, but you had to print it out and bring a piece of paper showing it.
Yeah. That's crazy.
I do just want to point out that this conversation so far is making the two of us seem very old.
We are. That's
Pretty old.
I introduced us as veterans, and I think if you're working over 20 years in the bike industry, you are a veteran, and you are actually in that kind of setting, you are old.
Yeah, old or stubborn or foolish or unqualified for anything else.
Oh, we should have called RC to get on the show then, huh?
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we make a second part of that, and maybe get Richard Cunningham as well on it, and maybe it will be a 5-hour show with all the stories. The interesting thing is, and this is when the online media started, nobody took it seriously. This lack of trust from trade shows or brands showed it, because it was just, what are you doing? You just have a website. You don't have a magazine. You don't have you can't really prove anything. And this was way before actually, let's say, professional websites, online media provide numbers. They show how many users they have. They show how many clicks an article gets and report that back to the manufacturer. And then you get down this rabbit hole of marketing and return of invest and cost per click, etc., which now is a big deal. And at some point, and I can't really say when, we saw a shift of online media is just a hobby becoming a very professional beast compared to print.
Well, I think a lot of that, I guess to talk about the first thing that you mentioned there, I think there was a lot of doubt in terms of legitimacy as far as websites go, because back then, in order to publish anything, certainly in print, more often than not, you had to be part of a bigger publishing house, right? Like to have journalists, to have them on payroll, to do layouts and photography and actual physically printing and distribution. Like it was a pretty big operation. You couldn't just have somebody just decide to do this one day on their own. And the thing that was interesting about websites, obviously, as you know, is that it really democratized a lot of publishing, because all of a sudden a lot of those barriers were removed. You didn't have to have any of that stuff. It did also, I think, rightfully bring up questions in a lot of people's minds as far as like, well, now like you're just a website, how do I know you're legit? And I feel like a lot of that really went away with the rise of, just sort of the bigger tech powerhouses in general, like, Google, Facebook, that sort of thing. Like I think as people just got more familiar with the internet in general, and as that became more and more a part of our everyday lives, all of a sudden the internet was like that's just what it was. Like I can't really put a finger on a year or a time frame exactly, but there definitely was a very big shift in terms of the internet being a novelty to being like all of a sudden that's where you had to be.
A novelty, and it became, as you said, an everyday life. You would bring a magazine, and there's a joke like you put it on in your restroom. The bike magazine at some point is a restroom read, right?
Yep, yep.
And oh man, we should know that when the big start and rise of smartphones came, because I think there's a correlation as well.
My first smartphone was a Palm Pilot, a Palm phone.
I was late to the party, but you could consume media through a smartphone.
Yeah, I had a Palm Trio 650. I still remember the model number. I can't remember what year it was, but I do very distinctly remember being at a Scott Press event in Sun Valley, Idaho. They were launching some mountain bike thing there, and this was before the days of press embargoes when companies would have an assigned date when things would get launched and that sort of thing. Back then, it was just a free for all. Whoever could get it up first is like you won. And back then, when I was working for, I guess I was working for Cycling News, I think. May have still been back then, or may have been Bike Radar at that point. I can't remember. But I very remember we did some like overnight mountain bike ride, and I was in a tent, and I had my camera with me, and I had at that point a BlackBerry, and I was able to download the photos from my from my camera, put it onto a micro SD card, upload the photos one by email from my BlackBerry, send it off to my production editor who was in Australia at the time, and we got an article up. I had the full article up, all the information, pictures, everything. It was published by the time we all woke up the next morning, and no one had any internet back then. Very few people had smartphones. And then by the time we got back into civilization, people were like opening up their computers and trying to get reconnected and stuff like that. And I already had my article up, and everyone was like, "What the hell? When did that happen?"
That was one of the turning points. And then I remember attending press camps, as you said, the moment the people, not only press camps, but also bike events, races, World Cups, the moment you were the first to publish an article to the web, you won. As you said, you won, and you could show, and there's actually a research paper about this. The very first article about any topic in the internet wins by far in reach, because it will appear, and people which are craving this kind of information or want to know who won whatever World Cup, Rampage, or are interested in this new shifting system, whatever, will be on your website, and they will forward the link to the website, and it's kind of a snowball system, and it multiplies. And I remember when exactly like you sitting in your tent trying to download it from a micro SD card. It was stressful because you're working for an online media. You were in a very different position. You could see like the print guys, they will chill out. They had like their dinner. My deadline is far out. I have 2 weeks to go, and they get hammered and have a good time. It's paid holiday.
Yep. I very much remember a lot of those trips.
The online guys were like the ones like not attending maybe the party, trying to find proper Wi-Fi because it always sucked at the hotel. So you try to pump up the photos, pump up the text, get everything done. And maybe struggling with the content management system like WordPress and whatsoever, and getting your article out and publish it. It was maybe just before really companies started to pushing embargoes.
You were talking about that phenomenon of whoever gets their article out first basically collects all the eyeballs, right? And I think that is when a big part of that shift happened between online and print media, because as pretty and tangible as print media was, it really became obvious very quickly to both the audience and to the industry that while those things were still true, it was still nice to hold a big, like, nice glossy piece of paper in your hand. A lot of times by the time those magazines came out, that news was a month old. It was pretty to look at, but it wasn't necessarily informative because you already knew about it. Yeah, I mean, I can't even begin to tell you how many of those press trips I'd been on where, I would stay up until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning because I had to write up the article right then and there and try to get it up right away. And it kind of sucked in a lot of ways, but it was also kind of exciting to be able to, again, like, you had sort of that little thrill of being first. Like, it definitely was a competition back then.
100%.
Yeah, and it was very much a question of, like, it was almost like who could stay up the latest, or who could duck out of dinner the soonest, and that sort of thing. Like, who could find the internet, who could find some cafe or restaurant somewhere that I would sit outside of businesses that had open Wi-Fi routers. Can't begin to tell you how many times I did that.
No, I totally get it. We all did the same thing, and it was a funny, but also somewhat of a friendly competition.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah,
Pinkbike was one of the earliest had strengths in numbers. They were like insanely fast. Once we also had we shared a flat together, like MTB News and Pinkbike around Sea Otter, and it was a race. It was literally a race. Like, who covered which news brand, hot news stuff at a booth, whatever. And you would, like, in the morning, you would actually look at the other side. Shoot, I didn't cover that. We got to run there and cover that as well.
yep, yep.
It
Yeah, it
was
was very much a race to be quick and first, for sure. For a long time, that was the name of the game.
from editor perspective. Editors had to have a huge variety of skills. It wasn't only that, like, an editor could attend anything and just get his writing done. He had to carry a camera, and he had to make it look actually good, because a good opener photo will draw the people again into the article, and you will justify your work because you attract more readers and you get better click rates. And overall, in the end, this would transfer to a legitimation of your media outlet. And the bigger your numbers were, looking like this is a kind of a brag competition. Who is the biggest, right? And thinking again of the times you would give in an URL at the accreditation, and they would look you up if you are actually legit. And then you would bring up at some point numbers. People started to compare those numbers to the actual numbers of print outlets.
Yep, yep, yeah. When people started to realize that there was a lot more tangible data associated with online publishing, that's when I feel like a lot of things started to change. Because with print media, you would have your subscription figures, and then publishing houses would kind of artificially inflate their exposure numbers, because they would assume that if someone had a print magazine, that they wouldn't be the only ones to read it. They would maybe hand it off to somebody else, or like it would be sitting on a coffee table and someone else would read it, so on and so forth. And it was very fuzzy math. Whereas with internet publishing at that point, you really had hard data. Like, you knew not only how many people were reading articles, but where they were. A lot of times you could identify who they were. You knew where they were, what time of day of the week, all that stuff. All of a sudden you had all this information. And for the manufacturers, that obviously was really valuable to them, because they want to sell more stuff. And back then and there, media, whether it was print or online, the way that they paid the bills was still through endemic advertising, the ads that were purchased by bike industry companies. And they wanted that information. So if they could put their ad into an online magazine or an online a website where they had real data, and the cost to them per 1,000 exposures or something was so much fewer than what it would get from it was so much low, it was so much cheaper to buy an online ad than it was to buy a print ad.
100%.
That at that point, that really shifted things a lot, I think. I mean, I don't really know what the actual numbers were, because I've never been involved in the publishing or advertising side, but my understanding, it was orders of magnitude cheaper to advertise online.
100%. I can give a little bit of an insight on that without, like, calling numbers. In the 90s, I worked at the newspaper, and it was mandatory. And we pushed very, very hard to get the overall run for that newspaper over 100K per day. Because there are rules on how much you can charge per square millimeter for your advertising. And if you would have crossed the 100K print run, you could literally double your cost for advertising. And you mentioned it already. Online media became attractive because it was way cheaper to put in an ad. They were craving for any kind of money, and print was established. They were the big players back then. It was like, we are the media. Nobody would take it online seriously until this, what we explained earlier, this kind of race started. And the online media became legitimate.
Yeah, and again, like, because people wanted to know about stuff right away, like all of a sudden you had friends who were like, you know, they maybe they'd be plugged into online media and they would find out about stuff really early. And then, you know, you'd be there with your buddy who was spending time on the internet, and they were always the ones who knew about all this new stuff that was coming out. And if you were the guy who was still primarily getting your stuff through print, you're like, what are you talking about? I haven't heard of that. And then you didn't want to always be in the dark. You know, you wanted to know what was going on too. So then all of a sudden that just everyone got online.
The fact that you also online, you're not restricted in space. The thing is, to that day, I also do kind of some write-ups for print magazines, but they have super strict rules on how many photos they can use. They will take up space, but you need to explain a complex product, maybe new suspension, for instance. You need to show the suspension, you need to show it in action. And today it goes all the way down to an app, and you need to have the screenshot in there. And this all takes away space for your actual write-up. In print, you had the delay in publication, and you still, to that day, you have not unlimited space. While online, whatever, just make it scrollable to... It's like endless. You can put in anything. It's good and bad at the same time, because sometimes it's just too big and people just jump to the conclusion of the write-up. Maybe not necessarily are interested in this kind of deep dive, and you putting all time in write-up and making beautiful photos and putting in geometry tables, etc. It has been, the online media built somewhat of a reputation of getting the real information, because you can get all of it. Not necessarily just this tiny text box in the print run. And here's a giant had this new bike and it's whatever. While online you had, this is the new bike, this guy's riding it, this is the geometry, and it's just like extensive in comparison.
Yep. Yeah, it got to the point where all of a sudden it very quickly went from online being a disadvantage to being online being a very big advantage. And I feel like that shift from a consumer perspective, from an audience perspective, changed very quickly. And I feel like from the media side as an industry anyway, that shift happened, I feel like, very slowly for far too many print outlets. I mean, we can see by, you know, if we talk about how many print outlets you and I were familiar with back then, I just do a quick survey, how many of them even still exist now?
Yeah. Also, if you put yourself into or maybe explain to the listeners out there, an editor for a print magazine would always need to fight for the space in the magazine.
Yep.
You couldn't just say, oh, here's a new product, I want to cover it on 6 pages. Because every page costs money to produce.
Yep.
Not only like the actual paper, but ink, but the graphic designer who puts it together, the lecturer who needs to proofread, and everything. You come to the point, the editor or the journalist, while we always try to have journalists separated from the sales department, but the sales department gets a lot of say over the editors, because they can't just use up space and produce costs without pulling in advertisers.
Yep.
And we mentioned it earlier, and the cost for a print ad to that day, because the print magazines have so much overhead compared to online media, classical print media houses, they have a big office, they have a sales department, they have a front desk person, it's a lot of money they need to earn every month to just keep the machine running. While online, it started so basic. You don't need an office. You don't need no front person. You don't need a whatever. It's
No,
cheaper.
I remember when I first started working for Cycling News, I was working remote. I think I was still living in Michigan at the time, but I had shortly thereafter moved to Colorado. I definitely did not have a physical office. I had a production editor who lived in Australia. Don't remember if I think Cycling News did have a physical office at the time in what was it, Surrey Hills, Australia, I think it was, somewhere around there. But it was a very small operation. I mean, you basically just needed internet and a few computers, right? It was the overhead costs were microscopic, and I still remember Cycling News was purchased by Future Publishing in maybe like 2008 or something like that. I can't remember. I remember going to Bath in the UK and visiting the main office for Future Publishing. Oh my God, it was like multiple floors and all these people and all these cubicles everywhere. Like holy, and they published something like 100 different print magazines or something. I was just like, what on earth? Like,
Yeah.
holy cow.
You always feel pretty humbled when you saw this kind of stuff, because for me, I started with online, working for an online, and you just winging it, whatever. Like
Yeah.
you have in the best case scenario, you are able to formulate a little bit of a couple of sentences, and are able to hold up a camera and make a photo looks kind of decent, and you're done. There's no person needed to do color correction to make it to print.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how a lot of print outfits were frustrated at the time because a lot of them did put an awful lot of work into, like you had art directors who were really careful with layouts and fonts and like, all this other, like you were talking about color correction and all this other stuff. There was all this effort put into making things pretty. And early on with internet media, again, like you said, the emphasis was on getting it done quickly. There wasn't necessarily a lot of emphasis on quality. It was quick. There maybe was a lot of quantity, but there wasn't a whole lot of thought necessarily always put into what you were writing or what images you were producing because, as you said, there was no limit. I kind of wonder for a while if for sure, I think there was maybe a period where internet media wasn't very good, again because those barriers to entry were so low because anyone could put up anything and everything. It was certainly nice to be quick and first, but it was always my goal to be quick and first and good. It became pretty clear that it was a race to the bottom as far as who could be first, and that at that point it became a lot less appealing to just be first. You wanted to be first and good because, as you were saying, back in the day, all you had to do was to be the first one to get the information out. But quickly it became obvious that you wanted to be ideally first, but ideally very quick to have a good article out because that is what people were going to pass around. And then that became the goal. So it did seem to evolve fairly quickly from there. And I think a lot of the individual blogs and that sort of thing, a lot of that stuff I think for a while kind of went away because there was a gradual shift back toward their people wanting a little more quality in the online publishing.
Quality is a good point because I think if you talk about media, you also have to talk about World Cup coverage or event coverage in the form of video. Because if you think of World Cup, downhill World Cup, because this was maybe visually very appealing, and there was with Alex Rankin and Alex Rankin maybe before Clay Porter, but they were covering something you haven't been able to see before. They were running around, traveling to all the venues on a budget and just covering it. And it was just like a point and shoot style, but it really influenced how we perceived media and the overall, let's say the heart of the scene, the core scene. It influenced how we understood ourselves. And it was really influential how they did it. And they did it once a year. And the series were called, either you could start with Sprung video or Erst series. Both series were chained into the box you would call a DVD. And this would be available at some point late in the year after the last race was finished. So you may knew that like this guy or this girl won this in that event, but you couldn't have seen this in a motion picture. You would need to order a DVD, and you were willing to pay. Not they weren't like expensive, but you would need to pay money to actually order the DVD. You would wait for it, and you could like invite your friends over, get chips and beer, and just watch it. You would be so stoked, and you would watch it on repeat. And I watched Erst and Sprung so many times. The music is embossed in my brain, and I would even know when like they mixed up the music and toned the music down, and you would hear so like the announcer would scream into the video, and Schladming, wo sind die Hände? It was so impressive. To bring this back to online media, there was one point where online media provided coverage video of the races in their magazines, in their online platforms. And this was a game changer.
Yeah, because I came to this realization a long time ago that as an editor, I feel like what people look for in what you produce is not so much, it's sort of like the information, that sort of thing. Like that's I mean, it's obviously important, but ultimately what it boils down to is, you have the privilege of access to an event or a company or a product and that sort of thing. And that is exactly the sort of thing that most people do not have, but they want. They so desperately would love to just like see this thing or hold it in person. And so I realized pretty early on that ultimately what my job really was to do was to make it feel like someone was there, like they were holding some part in their hand, like make sure to ask the questions that I feel like they would want answered. When I put myself in that perspective, that I feel like that maybe changed how I handled things a little bit, because changed my perspective on what I was supposed to be doing. So like, back to what you were talking about with World Cup coverage, for sure. I mean, very few people were able to travel to all of these events, especially if they didn't live in Europe. If you were a hardcore mountain biker, like you so would love to be there. Like you wanted to like hear everything, like, smell all the smells and see everybody and like see all these people in person. Having a DVD at the end of season was kind of okay, but it was way more powerful to be able to watch something online when it was either live or close to live, and at least get some kind of like some little bit of sensation that you could actually go. When you can transform someone from where they are sitting to wherever it was that you were, where you were creating this coverage, that's where the power came from.
Absolutely. And again, if you compare print to online, print, you're so restricted. You could have like, some of them had what they called galleries, like in the first couple of double spreads, you would have like maybe the winning guy railing the last corner or whipping it sideways. But these were like maybe 6 to 8 pages maximum. But I'm thinking of one of the first whip-offs. I think it was the first whip-offs I covered as a photographer. You would shoot maybe 2,000 photos in 2 hours, because of course it's not like necessarily you pick like 5 bangers. You would have maybe only 5 bangers, but the essence of this event, you could make an article online and put in 80 photos.
Yep.
No big deal.
Yep.
And then in addition to that, I had a tiny GoPro 2, whatever. And
God, they were so terrible.
and I had just that, like holding it like on top of my camera and just like panning it. And it was just insanely lo-fi. I stick that together in a iMovie, I think. It was so random. And I just put that in the article as well. And it was, you could hear the people screaming. You could hear the free hub literally yelling at you out of the speakers because it passed so close. You said able to feel the event. This is something you could only do, even though it was lo-fi. It was only possible by having the option to put in a video. And this was online only.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I feel like as things like YouTube really started to get popular in terms of when I look at it in terms of product, I can't remember when exactly this started to become really popular, but there was this period where we had all these unboxing videos, right? Remember when that was like a thing? And I think that ultimately, as far as why they were so popular, it boiled down to what I was talking about earlier with being able to provide someone with the idea that they are holding the product. Like a lot of times those unboxing videos were shot from a POV style. And so, you could almost sort of imagine that it was your hands unboxing this thing and, moving it around and playing around with that sort of thing, because that's the sensation that you wanted to provide to someone. Like they didn't physically have the thing in their hands like you did, but you wanted to be able to give them that sensation.
And this is maybe the moment online media started to sprint. They hit the ground running, and print media, they were still in the start block. They were at the start gate and haven't started anything. Some of them, they were smiling down, we say in German, on online, and maybe only to realize at some point, dude, we might need to do this kind of, cross media, like having a print issue, but adding to it in an online appearance, and maybe add to your write-up, which could be maybe different, but you need to catch that emotion, and you need to literally expand your space in a bigger writing, showing more photos and maybe showing a video. Online media were already like 60% of the race.
Yeah, and again, because the online outfits were so much smaller and had fewer people, and again, like you said, lower head counts and less overhead, that sort of thing, we could move so much faster. Looking at big publishing houses, it took them a long time to make decisions because, again, as they were used to dealing with these huge advertising contracts, when you're dealing with that kind of scale, things don't happen very quickly. And at that point in time, I feel like, unfortunately for a lot of them, a lot of those changes needed to happen very quickly, and they didn't. So we did see a lot of print titles go away.
They went away because maybe they tried to compete on something which they couldn't, because there's no possibility to open up a magazine and see a video.
Right.
And I think there's a couple of magazines, and you said it, many of them disappeared. Many. In the US, even more than in Europe. In Europe, there is still like, if you do like some research, you see there's somewhat of a 50-50 readership, which is very different to the US. Here's still a market for print magazines, but still, print magazines, and as you said, it's like a big tanker. They can't do a swiftly change. They need to reinvent their storytelling. I'm not super familiar about what Single Track did, and then with the rise and buy-up of Beta started in the US. I think FreeHub did a similar thing. They changed the way they're producing their content. For instance, FreeHub has a super strong online version of it, but in their magazine, they're putting in the extra love to make it more of a, let's say, it's not a magazine, but rather a coffee table book.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, there was a big shift just, again, in terms of timing, because you couldn't, it didn't make sense to put the more time intensive stuff into the magazine because, again, people already knew about it. They didn't necessarily need to read it again. They didn't need to know about it anymore. So it did shift for a long time to, like you said, and I would say that like this shift is arguably even still happening. It moved to a lot more kind of like evergreen content, stuff that, it really was much more, you would have some more of your like, time intensive, maybe more of your heavily researched pieces, that sort of thing. Ones that you really did want to just sort of like sit down and read with a cup of coffee in the morning on a weekend, that sort of thing. Because certainly now, obviously the majority of media is online, but there is still valid romanticism with holding like this physical thing in your hand. Like my wife reads a lot of books. I definitely don't read nearly as many books as she does, but she never got into the idea of like an e-reader or Kindle, that sort of thing, because our daughter too. Our daughter's 11, and she has an iPad, but she doesn't read books on it necessarily.
Oh, interesting.
She absolutely loves to read. She has a book with her all the time. Literally all the time she has some sort of book with her. And she loves like flipping the pages and like sort of like the look and the feel. And my wife even talks about the smell of a physical book. There is an appeal to that. So I think it's good that to see publications shift to sort of like that dual channel model. But people do really have to be careful like what you put where.
Do you think that publication proactively should pursue the change in a narrative and put in different stories on paper?
I think you kind of have to. I don't know anyone who would have intimate knowledge of distribution numbers as far as like mainstream news here in the U.S. like New York Times, that sort of thing. But I would have to imagine that there's far more consumption of media online than in print, but they do still sell newspapers and magazines again for that reason. Like I can go to my local bookstore still, and there's still a huge rack of magazines there. I still get print magazines. I still subscribe to a handful of things because I don't always need to or want to read something right then and there, but there might be something that I want to read that I'll get to, later that week or the next week or something like that. And a lot of that stuff isn't necessarily super timely. It just doesn't really matter when I read it. I can pick up an issue of the New Yorker magazine or the Atlantic or something like that, and there could be a feature article in there that was written 3 months ago that is still interesting.
Yeah, but it's different. If you are a media house, you need to have like let's say two teams or two different kind of editors. One is the up-to-date, super fast-paced race results and product news. And then you have the evergreen people doing like the bigger stories that are like more of the core of the scene, like these emotional pieces, the travel stories. It doesn't matter if you're doing like bicycle trip over Iceland, to bring up an example. I don't care if it's happened 2 years ago, if it's an appealing story.
I almost look at people who work in media now, as far as editors, as like you can be a reporter or a writer. And I came to realize pretty early on that I'm much more of a reporter than a writer. And I feel like it's more often than not that the stuff that reporters are producing are the sorts of things that you'd want online. And then you have the writers who are really, really artists with words. That sort of content more often than not would end up in print. That's how I look at it anyway.
No, that's really beautiful. I like reporter versus writer. This is really to the point, I guess. Thesis. Online became so fast-paced that the writers went under the bus.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, like we were saying, because that still exists, the desire to be first. I think then by the very nature of online publishing, that is never going to go away. And I feel like I certainly know how it is in US society. I don't know how it is in Germany, but I would imagine it's not very different. There is just sort of a societal desire and need to have everything right now.
Instant
People want to know what's
gratification.
going on. Yeah, they want everything right now. They want all the information right now. I see it in my kid now. She's not really necessarily used to looking things up or researching. She can just ask Siri or look something up on Google, and all of a sudden the information is right then and there. She's slower to figure things out on her own because it's so easy for her to find the information somewhere. That unfortunately still drives this race to the bottom, I think, where people are still compelled to be really quick with stuff. And that's a dangerous thing to chase after, because someone is always going to be quicker. Like, you could type 200 words a minute, right? And then hit publish as soon as you're done, even if you had no typos, anything. But if you're competing against, someone who's live streaming on social media or something like that, they don't have to do anything. They just publish as they see it and maybe have some sort of running commentary, and they're done. You can't beat that in terms of time.
Yeah, you need to adapt. I think that depending on the speed of your media, to put it this way, you have to adapt your content.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. We haven't even talked about social media yet, because that's been this other incredible evolution in terms of media. Because in terms of speed and the style of consumption and that sort of thing, social media has completely changed things now. So I took off for about maybe 4 months or so in between when I left Escape Collective to when I started up my own venture. And I was only just kind of doing stuff on Instagram every now and then, almost kind of for fun, kind of just to like, keep not keep busy, but like kind of like keep my skills somewhat sharp to some extent. And there was one piece of news that I broke. It had helped that I was somewhat local. There was a big online retailer here called the Pros Closet, just by word of mouth and knowing certain people. I had gotten word pretty early on that they were shutting down, and I had posted something on an Instagram story. As far as I could tell, that was the first word that had gotten outside of the Pros Closet that they were shutting down. There were no news articles online anywhere. Like there was nothing on forums and whatnot. But that's all it took to be first necessarily. And at the time, I wasn't really, again, I wasn't working. I wasn't even trying to fill out information or kind of be more in depth. It really didn't matter to me at that point. Yeah, that's all it took for me to be first. Was it good? I don't know. I mean, other people wrote more in-depth stories later that I think were better, certainly. But if you just want to be first, that's all it takes now.
Did it show in the numbers that you're the first and then people forwarded it? I mean, there's like a lot of insights actually in your standard social media. Looking at Instagram, you can see like, oh, you reached this amount of non-followers, for instance.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't remember what that post looked like in that sense. I don't remember if I even looked. I did see later that it did generate a fair bit of discussion in various places online, like forums and that sort of thing. People definitely were talking about it, but there was a lot of like, well, they haven't made any announcement, and they only have a sale going, so on and so forth. Like, is this just some rumor? Is he looking into this too much? So on and so forth. And yeah, it was interesting. It definitely it was like a little drop of food coloring in a bucket of water. It definitely spread.
Social media as well. I mean, all the big publications out there. Let's talk digital online platforms. They really pushing. I mean, social is a bit of a beast. If you, for instance, putting in a link to drag people off social media towards your website, it's being penalized. So it's not super easy to play social media game if you have an actual platform. But still, like online, doing a pretty decent job using this tool. And print is working eagerly to catch up. Like putting in a format, trying to explain also basic stuff like what is a flat pedal, what is a click pedal, for instance. So they're trying to put on these evergreens. I saw that as a trend as well.
Yeah, I mean, social media, like you said, it is a whole separate beast. It's an entirely different thing. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that you can be a full-time social media influencer and like make literally millions of dollars being on social media. It still blows my mind. like we can talk about that more later. But yeah, social media for me has been interesting because I primarily spend most of my time, at least on social media, on Instagram. I walked away from Facebook and Twitter quite a while ago for various reasons, but Instagram for me started out just being kind of like this fun way to just almost like, publish pictures that don't seem to have any sort of relevance anywhere else with stuff that I was doing for work. And it was just sort of another thing to kind of just put out there. And it definitely has grown into its own separate thing. These days I use it more almost kind of like a marketing tool for my work, but it is also just fun to put stuff out there. It is just like a separate, almost like just entertainment channel. But I have also watched it evolve, like in terms of how I use it. Like I got into, like a lot of people seemingly, I got into baking during the pandemic, and my Instagram feed is essentially filled with like sourdough baking tips and mountain biking and dog stuff and that sort of thing. And at any given moment, I can look at something for like, should I use a Dutch oven or an open bake method, or like, when should I score my loaf? All this other stuff, and it's like there's a lot of useful information in there. So like it's interesting to see how social media has evolved. And again, I'm still trying to figure out, like, aside from being just obviously being paid to post certain things, like how the heck do these people make money? I don't get it.
It's insane. It's insane. It generated a very specific style of communication and presentation, which is And now I'm feeling old again because it's super annoying for me. Like a person screaming in the streets to buy this product and smacking the sign into your face, kind of
Yep.
thing.
Yep.
And it's not believable. It's like, okay, I'm paying this influencer this amount of money and he will hold up my product for 5 seconds and rave about it. And you're like, is this true? Is this you can see he did it like a bazillion times before, and he will present a pen, and the next week he will present an air fryer, whatever. Just pay him.
But yeah, but it doesn't matter. I mean, I remember reading a while ago about this. I think it was a Chinese social media influencer, and
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, go on.
it's not bike related at all. But she
I
she
know.
would literally just sit there in front of the camera and just a few seconds like show this thing and like say what it is as a link or whatever, and then like move on. Like there's this other
Yeah,
thing. Like that's all it was.
I
Like, are
saw
you
that.
kidding?
It was hilarious. It was hilarious. She was like totally like unemotional face,
100%.
ripping
Yep.
up and open the box, pulling up the clothes, smacking it to the side, open up the next box. It was hilarious.
It was hilarious, but it was also kind of depressing because it was just such overt, blatant consumerism.
I mean, it was actually art. Be honest.
It was perversely entertaining.
Yeah,
Like
it was somewhat. If you could go down into the rabbit hole and compare it to Andy Warhol and the consumer criticism, but maybe,
Yeah,
maybe
like there's another account I follow where it is nothing but someone who has a big hydraulic press, and all it is like just smashing stuff with this hydraulic press. That's all the account is. And they've got, I don't even know, like, 1 billion plus followers or something. I can't remember now. And it's mesmerizing. I don't know why I watch it every now and then, but I do.
stay away from cutting sand and cutting soap, huh?
Cutting sand and cutting soap.
Oh, this is the next thing. Like hydraulic press, if you go down that rabbit hole, like there's some super odd people cutting up soap
Oh.
and or kinetic sand.
Oh,
But yeah, maybe
interesting.
this is totally
no.
unrelated to bike media, but it's
We-
social media has its weird ways and weird depth.
I guess to bring up my kid again, I mean, we try to keep her off of social media in general because I can see in real time how those sorts of things can just suck you in and like literally rot your brain. Like she doesn't do this necessarily so much now, but I certainly have friends who have older kids who just sit there and just mindlessly scroll on Instagram or whatever, and like they are checked out. That brain is turned off. But that does seem to be unfortunately where a lot of things are going now, and it does. This topic is supposed to be, we're here talking about bicycle media, and it's interesting to see how things have evolved now because bike media in general, I would say, is not doing great in terms of business health and that sort of thing. And it's been kind of fascinating to see how different people and publications and that sort of thing have evolved or tried to evolve to figure out how to keep the lights on, because it really is all these shifting tastes and habits and desires and trying to just chase all this stuff to figure out what people want to see.
This was also my motivation to invite you for this kind of conversation, because you started and I started an own media, like an own kind of magazine, kind of news channel. Yours N minus one. It's so different the way your writing style is if you compare it to other media outlets. And there's I don't want to, like, in German we say put honey around your mouth, but you have a finesse in the way you write your text. And it's such a stark contrast to this fast-paced media out there. It's so calm and entertaining to read that it provides this contrast to what bike media has become.
No, well, thank you. I guess that wasn't really necessarily the intent, so to speak, but I feel like now, particularly if you are trying to be some sort of viable bike media entity, whether you are, a big publication with a big staff, or an individual like myself, or even just like, 2 or 3 people like you're doing with TestPilot, you have to identify where it is possible to compete, where it is possible to stand out with stuff. And for me, I feel like what I've been trying to do is just, I've done this for quite a long time. I feel like we were just saying earlier, at the beginning of this episode, that you and I have both been around for quite a long time, and we have physically seen and lived through a lot of different things, and we have seen a lot of things sort of come around full circle, or we're able to put things in a little bit more historical content, or maybe somebody can come out with something that a lot of people are like, oh, that's brand new, and you and I can be like, no, it's not. Someone did that 15 years ago. Here's the thing. And there's a lot of benefit to just having been around for that long. So I try to bring in some of that experience and context into what I cover. I think I try to use some of that to maybe kind of filter out what I deem to be sort of worth paying attention to and what's not worth paying attention to. But it's interesting looking now, particularly at online media. We were talking earlier about, we kind of touched on this idea that industry holds a lot of these press camp things, right? They introduce a product, they fly media into some location to check out this new thing, and they give you your spiel and their presentation and their product and so on and so forth. And when I look out at the room, at the people who are sitting in that conference room or wherever, just look at the audience of editors, it has been interesting to see how they've gotten progressively younger and younger. And there are a handful of people who I recognize and who I have literally traveled around the world with at all these different events. And there are several of them who have been around for quite a long time, but there are an awful lot of them who are literally half my age, which blows my mind. Absolutely makes me feel super old. But at the same time, it is super helpful to, again, be able to draw into that experience and that history with stuff, because a lot of those people just don't know about it.
I think, to circle back on why you and I started a different style in media, is that everything moves in waves, and we saw an ongoing acceleration in speed in publishing, which you said or framed as somewhat of a race to the bottom, because the quality will be lost along the way. And I think we are now in a phase of people would appreciate a change in tone and speed in an article, in a write-up, in a text. We dipped a little bit into social media, we dipped a little bit into influencers, and if you look into YouTube and you would type in review bike whatever, the most successful videos out there with the biggest clickbaits, and the numbers will show, are thumbnails with screaming typo, like Mr. Beast style photos or thumbnails, to put it this way. And I think we are at the verge of actually a turning point, that people are maybe not sick of it, but overwhelmed by it, and crave the book again, crave the calmness again, and the being more reasonable in a text.
I think it's certainly not the majority of people who want that. I think we are still very much heading in that direction of, kind of like that race to the bottom that I was talking about. But for sure, I really do agree that there is a growing contingent, albeit minority, of people who do want the more in-depth information, the more thoughtful piece, that sort of thing. That's certainly the sort of audience that I'm looking for, kind of like the more informed and kind of nuanced person. It's interesting, like you mentioned sort of like the Mr. Beast style YouTube thumbnail video. And I remember having a conversation with Ray Maker over at DC Rainmaker. And if you are at all interested in sports electronics and fitness devices, that sort of thing, he has been for quite a long time the absolute authority on all that stuff, because he is so incredibly in depth. Like his style of media content is very much geared almost exclusively toward online, because that sort of thing would just never exist in print. Like you'd have like a 10,000 word review of something. Like you would just never see that in print. But he also he very intelligently kind of plays the game. He told me that when he realized pretty quickly that when he's producing a YouTube video, he'll get twice as many views if he just has like an arrow pointing at something, or like he's gotten very savvy as far as putting together his YouTube videos to appeal to that person who is most drawn to like the shiniest thing, right? But at the same time, like he's very good at drawing in that audience, but then he sucks you into this rabbit hole of like a 15-minute article or 15-minute video on a watch, that sort of thing. So he's done an exceptional job of playing both sides of that coin. I like it because he has the realization of being able to play to people's tendencies like that, but also being able to simultaneously provide that depth of information that people should want.
The difficulty in that is that you need to understand as a viewer, because the human brain functions pretty predictable. So if you start knowing that this video will provide a certain style, it will show in the thumbnail. And people will know how to drop videos or how to do a bunny hop, really whatever, will have a similar look and feel like a review of a new e-bike, for instance. And you will pretty easy understand with a glimpse of an eye that this is mountain bike content. And this is a very specific style. And if you mention this guy doing a 15-minute review of a watch, he might have a bigger quality in a video, but wrapping it up in a Mr. Beast package. So this is the point of where I'm curious of how to diversify a thumbnail to actually showcase, hey, this is actual information and not just clickbait and not just rewriting of a press release, right?
Yeah, it's tricky, but I feel like for a lot of those things, it would be, maybe this is just me fooling myself, but I do wonder how viable it would be for someone to put together a 1-person or 2-person publication who is completely new at it. Because at that point, all you really do have to draw on is, that ability to sort of pull in the initial eyeballs and to kind of play the tricks and like be flashy and that sort of thing. I don't think anyone reads my content because it is flashy. And, when I was doing a lot of video stuff, they certainly weren't looking at those videos to see me. Like that they were not doing that. But I feel like people were interested because I was hopefully able to provide some useful information for them that they could then take to decide if they wanted to, do something on their bike or, purchase a new bike or keep their old one or whatever. I feel like it's challenging to be able to put together something like that on your own if you don't have that level of experience to draw from. So that N-1 thing, I run that on Substack. That was the platform that I chose to use. And if I look at some other writers that I look at who I follow on Substack, like, if I look at U.S. politics, for example, like Robert Reich, he was, was he like former Secretary of Commerce, I think? Anyway, I can't remember what position he used to hold in government. But I read his stuff because it is incredibly insightful to see what someone with that level of experience sees in a situation that I might not have seen. And that's the sort of information that I am drawn to. And I feel like that's the sort of information a lot of other people are drawn to. And that's not something that I would be drawn to if I were interested in, Robert Reich is not putting together fancy thumbnail images on YouTube. He's not doing that.
And I think if we revisit the topics we touched and looking at the constant acceleration in media production and media consumption and lower attention spans and your race to the bottom quote, I think the media, by providing this kind of content, it was a lower quality and it could be produced cheaper, but the overall quality declined. And now you need to provide towards a brand or a company, you need to provide value. And the moment you are providing a value which is not distinguishable to a social media influencer, like the content you provide as a magazine, and you're doing the same fast-paced style as an influencer, the influencer, you can maybe just send free product or a couple of dollars and he will do it. But the media, needs to elevate their game to a point to justify actual pay for their work.
Right. Yeah, and that sort of thing is frustrating because, as I mentioned earlier, like looking at how a lot of social media influencers not only make money but are making a lot of money, they are very much capitalizing on well, I shouldn't say all of them, but certainly a lot of them are very much capitalizing on this concept of just pure entertainment. And more power to them for having figured out how to do that and to play that game. For better or worse, that's just not necessarily how I operate. That's not, I just can't do that. It's been interesting to see how things have sort of come around full circle, where you had print media who were concentrating seemingly on quality, maybe not necessarily quantity. They weren't necessarily super fast. And then you had this shift toward online media where it was a lot of quantity and speed. And then now we're coming back a little bit more toward a desire for more quality, in one aspect of things anyway. But then you also have social media. It's just like, again, still continuing this race to the bottom. But it has really been fascinating to watch how certainly things with my publication has progressed, and talking with subscribers and listening to what people want to see. There is certainly a desire and almost just sort of an exhaustion with how things have evolved now. Like it is kind of exhausting to just be constantly bombarded with all of this social media stuff and so much information. Like I don't necessarily need to know absolutely everything about everything right now. I don't need to know it. I don't want to know it. I can't process it all. Certainly as things have gotten busier and faster paced in my own life, certainly with, having, wife and our daughter and a house, and like things are just always busy. And sometimes I just want things to slow down.
Do you think that curating content is the goal or a solution?
Oh, I think to some extent, and I think yes, because there is certainly a limit to how much and what people can consume. It's been interesting, again, as far as watching the growing number of people who have had long careers in journalism and media launch into solo ventures. It's been interesting to see how that sort of thing has evolved, because you do have audiences who come to really trust and rely on certain individual people to, they trust them to tell them what they need to know, or, give them the advice that they can believe in, that they can kind of walk away with and lean on. Because in some sense, that is a level of self-curation. Like you follow the people that you want to follow because they have provided good information or they've been reliable in the past. Me being just a one-person operation, I certainly can't cover anywhere near as much ground as I would love to. At this point, I'm kind of settling into a rhythm of publishing 2, maybe 3 things per week, and there's only so much ground I can cover. It just takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. I'm still shooting a lot of my own photos, that sort of thing, because I do try to still maintain a level of quality that I feel like I need to maintain. Would I love to do more? Sure. But I'm sort of self-curating, I guess, to a certain extent, because, almost just out of necessity. But I think a level of curation is necessary because, again, like it's easy to be overwhelmed. Like I don't want to know everything. And I feel like a lot of people feel the same way because it's just exhausting.
You're using Substack, and we don't need to cover your business model in detail, but the people out there are trained towards, I'm able to read every information, every review online for free. I can watch every World Cup coverage for free. Now that changed. You have to have a subscription to watch World Cup, for instance. But you also have, like in your model, you have some stuff you can read for free and you can subscribe to it, and you can have more extensive information and a broader text and insights. But people, they need to adapt for that. And let's put the word of a paywall out there. So if you want to have a person, an editor, a journalist, spending his time and work onto something, and he needs to make some money from that. So what do you think is the future of that? Will there be more paywalls and subscription models again? Because there always will be this fast-paced social media unboxing videos. This is the new product. And is this enough for the community, the bike community out there?
Obviously, that's a hard question to answer, and I don't know if I have the answer to that. I think I'm still trying to figure that out myself. We certainly have seen a huge rise in subscription models in general, just in general society over the last few years. Like we used to, it really wasn't all that long ago that if like for TV, for example, you chose a cable provider and you chose your package and you got like, here you can choose the 120 channel package or the 40 channel package, whatever. And now you have separate subscriptions to Disney and NBC or like Peacock now.
Netflix and whatever.
Yeah, you pay for all these things individually, and now we end up paying the same, if not more, than we used to anyway. That sort of thing has become kind of frustrating there, and I can see how it has started to be more frustrating in kind of more specialty media too. A lot of people had the impression that, like, if we go all the way back to print media, for example, or even newspapers, people had the idea that what paid the bills, what kept those businesses going, were the subscriptions, right? But ultimately, those subscriptions, all they did were provide a vehicle for those publications to generate viewership numbers that they could then take to advertisers and be like, look, if you buy an ad, I know that I can expose you to 100,000 people. Like you were saying with that newspaper where you're trying to hit that magical 100,000 number. And with the rise of Google and Facebook and that sort of thing, all those advertising dollars went away. They're all gone. And now you have these subscription models as publications and titles have tried to figure out other ways to bring in revenue. They've realized that, if their main source of income is gone, how do you bring in revenue? But now online media was free for so long. People they've been accustomed to, like you said, being able to get all this content for free. So now still, okay, how do you pay for that? So now the thing that has been really popular now are these, they call it affiliate models, right? So if you go to online media, they'll cover some product, and then somehow at the bottom of that product review, you have this magical link that takes you to a manufacturer website or something that like lets you buy the product right then and there. And if you, usually more often than not now, if you click on that link, even if it's not explicitly described as an affiliate link, you click on that link. If you look at the actual URL in your browser, in your browser title bar, there's all sorts of code that goes after the website address that tells someone or tells the manufacturer that the source of that traffic was from this article, and then if someone buys that thing, that article or that publication gets a cut of that. That's how a lot of companies now are making money. So it's just this other new revenue stream that they've tried to come up with. But I've always had an issue with that because, I feel like whether intentional or not, or, whether it's well-intentioned or not, you'll see more often than not now little disclaimers at the top of articles saying like, okay, we have affiliate links, but they don't influence our editorials, so on and so forth. Like, okay, that may technically be true, but really, like if
It
I'm
sounds weird.
if it sounds weird if I'm a reader, like, okay, I'm reading a product review of this thing, and you're telling me straight up that if I buy this thing, you get a cut of it, but you're telling me that because I get a cut of it,
tell me it's good. Because you want me to spend money because you
exactly.
It
doesn't pass the sniff test, right? That as I describe it. And it's been that's been frustrating for me because it doesn't feel good, but yet more people are using it because they have to figure out some way to keep the lights on, because being able to shift consumer tendencies into this idea of paying for the content that they want to consume is a very, very slow progression. I certainly wish it was a faster progression. But that's a slow thing for people to change their mindsets on as a general population. Like, people have not been used to paying for content for so long that now
neither do the manufacturer.
Yeah. So it's definitely a shift that is, I feel like it is happening. It is happening, albeit slowly. But there is also this tendency, because everyone is having to pay for all this content piecemeal, that they're tired of having to do all these things individually. You have subscription burnout, basically.
Also, it's hard to pay actually for it. Let's say I want to read an article on New York Times. I want to be just at maximum 2 clicks away of paying them, I don't know, $2, whatever, for reading that one article. But I have to put in my credit card. I have to be at least, even though the first month is free, I will be at some point in a subscription. And I hate that. As you said, we are tired of that. And it's not easy to pay for it. And there are different concepts out there, like these links, buy me a coffee or whatever, or have a Patreon and providing your content there. And it's all not super easy. And people, as you said, we are just tired of it. Even though you would like to support, you don't, because it's too hard.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because we've brought up this idea of things coming around full circle several times as we've been having this conversation. And one of the things that it was kind of funny to see me read this, or it was kind of funny for me to read this somewhere, but someone was talking about how they subscribe to several authors and Substacks sort of thing because they want to hear their perspectives of all these people. And they were kind of joking and like, oh, if only all those people could come together for one thing and kind of all join forces into one publication, and then I can pay just one thing. And like, oh, right. But then that would be sort of like a website or a magazine that you pay for. And like, oh, wait, that's what we start. Yeah.
Going full circle.
Yeah. So, but I think a lot of that has been, we haven't even touched upon this yet, but one frustration has been how, yes, that is how a lot of those things used to work. But with this, what we've seen lately with a lot of titles consolidating under these big, huge entities like
media outlets, like outside.
Yeah, like outside, they've bought literally hundreds of titles and put them all together, and they're trying to do exactly that. But unless you're able to do that sort of thing and also retain the individual voices that people want to see and give those individual voices incentive to stay there, then you've basically lost what you're trying to put together, right? So it's tricky. I mean, ideally, you certainly would have all of the people that you specifically want to hear from all together in one thing. Like, I would love it if everyone that I wanted to read about, from bikes to baking to general news to cars, like, I would love it if everyone would come together into one magical publication that I could just pay one subscription for, and I could get everything in one content on one bill. That would be amazing. But the reality is that's just not going to happen.
If you put yourself into the shoes of a manufacturer and you have a shiny new product, you want to have magazines talk about positive, or hopefully in a positive way, to drive your sales about this new product because it's so good. You need to work with specific media outlets, and you build a relationship over the years with this kind of editors, this kind of media outlets. You have some kind of trust towards this media outlet that you won't be thrown under the bus because, this is like whatever carbon cross-country rim, and you're giving it to a media outlet and they don't care. They're just giving it to an enduro racer editor, and just like he smacks it. He breaks it in 1,000 pieces. And he said, this thing doesn't hold up. So trust burned. It's over. A manufacturer wants to have a trustworthy relationship to the media, to the editors, and wants to be able to give the product to an editor and get a review from.
Yeah.
Now we see, on the one hand, this big centralization of media, of making it unnecessary to give this one product or spend money in this media house to cover, to finance this article. You have on the one side this media house, and on the other side you have these influencers doing it for free. And you have, in the case of outside, you maybe have Pinkbike, and you have other media houses under Pinkbike. Why should you work with these other media houses when you have it already on Pinkbike? It's a monopolization, and they're paying just once because they are so strong. I don't want to pick on Pinkbike because they're doing a good job and just providing information out there. But they got so strong and so big that if any media outlet, which is tinier and even maybe now under the same umbrella of outside, they won't get any cut of the cake again. It's just because why should they work with you? You have your super tight, narrow target group of readers who are interested in, okay, now making something up, mechanical shifting. This is like your niche. Why should I work with you if I have like this bigger outlet and I get like 50 times more clicks and reach out of that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's completely understandable. It's interesting that, when I took my break from media work over the summer, I found it fascinating how much more open some long-term industry friends I've had within bike companies were. It was interesting to see how much more open they were with me about how a lot of those things work. And it was it was fascinating in the sense that, looking from, they were basically letting me know how things look from their perspective as like a product marketing person or that sort of thing. And it was a lot of exactly what you were saying. Like they will allot almost their entire marketing budgets toward outlets that they know will provide favorable or at least non-critical coverage, because that's what they want. They just want their product exposed, and they want it put in front of as many eyeballs as possible. And they don't want it disparaged, and they don't want it criticized ideally. They just want people to know about it. This is not to say that Pinkbike does that, because I do think that they like. I know a lot of the editors at Pinkbike still, and I do think that they do still do a pretty good job of being critical of a bunch of stuff. But like if we look at GCN, for example, they've been very careful. They've been very shrewd to never do product review, right? You will never see a product review on GCN because it's completely counter to their business model. But if you see a product on a GCN video, you can be 100% assured that the company whose product you see on that video paid to put that product on that video. And that's not necessarily a knock on GCN particularly, because again, they're not trying to be critical about any particular product. They're very specifically not evaluating product, but they've been exceptionally good about monetizing product placement.
Yeah.
And
And being entertainment and providing entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, they lean into it. They are absolutely not hiding at all the fact that they are entertainment first and foremost. Maybe some like general information here and there, but they are absolutely not evaluating product. They absolutely avoid it. More power to them, I guess. Like they don't. I would have much less respect for them if they did try to evaluate product and also were taking a lot of money from manufacturers for a product placement, because that's just completely unethical. So does what GCN is their business model, like, does that appeal to me? Not necessarily, but wow, does it work for them? Good for them.
Yeah.
So anyway, as far as what would motivate a manufacturer to work with someone who doesn't necessarily provide guaranteed positive coverage, that's a tough one, because am I seeing less willingness from certain brands to include me on stuff or to send product my way to review? I don't know if I have necessarily. I mean, maybe I'm seeing some of that just because, of course, I'm no longer working for a bigger publication. My numbers, I'm sure, are smaller. And if I hadn't been doing this for as long as I have, if I hadn't, built these relationships with people over however many years, then I probably wouldn't even be receiving access to stuff that I do now. It would be hard from a manufacturer's perspective to justify working with someone who's very small, because there's just not much of return on their investment, even if it's just loaner product, because not that many people are going to see it. But, so I think it almost comes down to more, it's kind of ironic that as far as what I'm doing, it almost kind of comes down to more fuzzy math to a certain extent, because you have to be willing to put a higher priority on like a higher value audience member as opposed to just straight numbers. Because certainly if I'm looking just at straight numbers from a manufacturer perspective, I don't provide that.
If you want to use marketing terms, you would say that your reader is actually further down the funnel. And maybe to explain this to non-marketing people out there, I try to really simplify that now and not diving into acronyms. So to have a customer know the product, he needs to see it at least this and that amount of times. May it be in an advertisement, in an editorial, and further down the line, in marketing, you call this the customer journey. You will be at the point where you consider the product to be on your list of items you want to purchase, or to be on the list of, okay, I want to buy a new tire, and there are this and that brand out there, and I read about this new tire model maybe 5 times. Should I spend my money not on a tire I actually know and used in the past, or make like the jump and try it out and be willing to spend my money on that? You could spend many advertising dollars to put your product in front of a lot of eyes. Let's say New York Times. You make a one-pager of your new bike tire in the New York Times print publication. A lot of people will see it, but only a tiny percentage of these people will actually ride bikes. So you have a big loss in your advertisement money because the people that actually read this are maybe not necessarily interested in this kind of bike tire. But if you're looking into this tiny niche magazine, which may have fraction of the followership and readership of the New York Times, these people are further down the funnel. We say it's a more narrow target group because they actually, if they read a bike magazine, I guess they might be interested into bikes. So they are way more willing to actually purchase this tire than the New York Times reader.
Right. I mean, that makes sense because I guess is what I was talking about earlier as far as it being like a higher value audience member to somebody. Yeah, I again, like my subscriber audience is, I guess looking at it now, it's not that small, surprisingly, but certainly not huge. But the level of engagement's pretty high. The level of readership's pretty high. I would say the level of general industry and product knowledge is surprisingly high, or maybe even not surprisingly high. Like it's just sort of the audience I've cultivated over the years. So yeah, I guess maybe a brand would be motivated to provide some loaner product to me to review because they would want to put that thing in front of that audience, whatever the coverage may be. And I guess that's sort of the game that I have to play now, right? I mean, but I guess from my perspective, it's been kind of nice that again, I can't cover everything. And I am certainly not lacking for things to write about. If anything, I am so wishing for another few hours in the day or another couple days in the week because I just cannot cover as much stuff as I want to.
Let's say you have 2 more persons on your team to cover this kind of stuff. Would you go down this route?
I would probably cover more stuff, but I think right now my what sits very high on my priority list is getting a podcast going again, because I did used to host a tech-focused podcast for not even really sure how many years now, and I do feel like it's another media channel, so to speak, that really appeals to a lot of people. I mean, a lot of folks don't have time to sit down and read a 4,000-word article. But if you had a podcast that went for an hour, or in this case, 2, if you had a podcast that ran for an hour or so, that you could just have running in the background while you're doing some other stuff, that people still would pay attention to that podcast, but they're still able to get all the things done. It just works better for a lot of people, or like listen to it in the car on the way to work. So if I were to have another 1, 2, 3 people, like podcast is definitely very, very high on my list of things to do. But I shouldn't even say probably, I would definitely cover more product stuff in general, because I just want to cover more. If I look at the sort of audience that I am trying to appeal to, it maybe by subconscious design, like I'm basically sort of appealing to people who are like me. Like they are middle-aged people who have been riding for a long time, who have a fair bit of experience with their bikes, who have probably multiple bikes, multiple different types of bikes, and have a lot of varied interest in cycling. And, there are a lot of things to cover there. Like I ride gravel bikes and cross country bikes and trail bikes. I have a dedicated park bike. I have fat bikes. I have cargo bikes. I try to spend as much time, as big a portion of my life sitting on a bicycle as I can, whatever type of bicycle that may be. And there is just so much out there, and it's hard to filter through everything. But if I view my typical audience member as being me, there is an awful lot of ground to cover, and I can't do it by myself.
The media, as we talked through the rise of print, the rise of social media, the changes it underwent, we will see maybe a transformation in the content in which channels it will actually go and how people will consume it. While we see, and you said there's this middle-aged person who has somewhat of a background and maybe an enthusiast to actually willing to read a longer review and also has the attention span of following a podcast maybe for an hour, or in this case 2. This person might get an offering again in the next couple of years, I guess, because the media needs to transform. And it's
so. And I think it's used to be that you wanted to be big as far as media. Like you wanted to be part of a big outlet, a lot of reach, a lot of resources. And now I feel like there has been this massive shift toward very small. Like you don't follow publications, you follow people. And there is a very challenging, like if you sit somewhere in the middle of there, like that's a tough place to be in. But now I feel like what I hear most often from people is I would say lives in general have gotten so busy, so hectic. People spend so much of their time being just trying to make it through the day sort of thing. That what they want now is you brought up this idea of curation earlier. They want to pay attention to the people that they know that they can reliably trust for good information, reliable information, truthful information. I feel like people are willing to pay for that. And I feel like there has been a big shift toward just following the people and publications and content that you feel like will make your life kind of better in some way, right? Like I am definitely not out there trying to be a cheerleader for every product or manufacturer or whatever. If I can keep someone from making a mistake, like if I can keep someone from buying some $5,000 bike that turns out to be not very good, then I would consider that to be a job well done. You said earlier that, you found my writing to be, I think you said entertaining. But if I can inform people, but also provide people with some level of entertainment that, maybe just brightens up their day even a little bit, even if it's just some sort of product review or whatever, if I can provide information and some sort of distraction from what might otherwise be cluttering up their lives, then I would consider that to be a successful venture.
That's a good point. It's the same if you want to compare it to music. You would say, I like to listen to jazz. And then that's pretty a broad spectrum to talk about jazz. Like, is it like freestyle, experimental, new jazz, old school jazz? Even just like, maybe you're totally not into some parts of this umbrella called jazz. Like there's like parts of it you don't like at all. And I think it's the same with the media, and you referred to it as people want to listen to a person they actually trust, and maybe got this trust like proven because they used the same product and had the same experience as it was written in the review or in whatever article. And maybe the same with music lovers. They will have a very specific style they like to listen to. Maybe they have also a very specific writing style they like to read or listen to. So that might be the future. Because we see even in the bigger picture in social structures, diversification in people, how they identify or what they try to do. Like you said, you have fun on every bike out there, but this is just you. And maybe out there's some person, it's a die-hard fat bike, single speed guy. And there's nothing besides that. Everything else just plainly sucks. I'm over exaggerating here, but you get the idea. So this guy might need to find the media outlet which is just covering this fat by single speed whatever, because he will be happy and he will be in his own echo chamber in a maybe good kind of way, because that's his escape. That's what he's interested in.
There's no way I can appeal to everyone, obviously, but if I can, so that's probably not the person that I am trying to go after, just because I'm not trying to hyper specialize like that. But again, like if I feel like for any media outlet, it's just absolutely critical to identify who your audience is or who you want it to be. And then you have to do everything. You have to put yourself in the perspective of that person. Like, what do they want to see? What do they want to hear? What is like the tone of what they want to hear? I'm not saying that you need to change who you are to suit that person, but I think it's really important to just keep in mind what that person wants to see, because especially for me, if I'm looking at it from the perspective of like, what am I doing that would prompt someone to actually pay to read and consume my content? What does that person want to see? And in my case, they want good, solid, deep information. And that's what I'm trying to provide. But I think every media outlet has to do that exact thing, and they can choose or not to figure out what sort of niche they want to cover, or if they want to be super broad, but they have to make that decision one way or the other and then go from there.
100%.
Fingers crossed. We'll see if I can make a living out of this.
Hopefully that's pretty much it, right? I mean, we covered it pretty extensively.
Yeah, for anyone who is still awake listening to this, thanks so much for listening, Jens. It was good to catch up with you again after so long. Maybe we'll actually see each other in person again sometime.
Hopefully. Maybe at some press camp again.
We'll see. Never know.
Perfect. Thank you.
As James said, we hope you are still awake after this deep dive on MTB media history. If you're enjoying this kind of longer form conversation, make sure you follow this channel and N-1 as well as TestPilot. Are you interested in bike kinematics? You may want to bookmark the 2 episodes with Dave Weigel. Manufacturing bikes and parts out of metal powder is something you want to hear more about? This will be the topic in the next episode. Thank you for listening.